Thanks for being in the room. The talk today, not today, the talk now, the last one before lunch break. And by the way, in case you wonder, you are in the lucky position because this room breaks a little bit earlier than the other room, so you're the first one to get lunch. But do me a favor, don't eat it all, because then they will complain. But as I said, we got some feedback that lunch will be handled better today. Everybody will get food. Also, thank you for giving us direct feedback on the lighting. We lowered the lighting a little bit because it was too bright in the very morning. We cannot make it any lower because then otherwise these beautiful people that speak here would not show up as beautiful as they are on camera and on the video. David, bist du bereit? Super. The plural of platforms. I hope this is not yet another platform engineering talk. This is a lot of... No, it's not. We talked about this, right? You have a lot of experience and in building platforms, in knowing what works, what doesn't work, and I think this is why it's great for you to be here on stage and enlighten us over the next 25 minutes. We'll try to have 5 minutes for Q&A, but if there's still questions, you will be at the booth as well.
Exactly.
Perfect. Yeah. Cool. Don, I would say I will leave the stage and I give it all to you.
Thank you so much, Andreas.
Yes.
Yeah, great to be here. Great to also be here, I think, the first year Square with a booth. So like Andy said, if you have questions, I'm here for the rest of the day. I also will be at our booth from time to time, so feel free to reach out. Like Andy said, I think this is not hopefully just another platform engineering talk, so I will not go too much into the definition of what a platform is and what a platform is not, and I will also not show too much YAML on the slides today, because I wanted to change it a little bit in a way that I share a little bit the learnings which we made to kind of give you a little bit my current perspective on this very buzzing topic, right, where we have a lot of organizations working on that thing, right? And the plural of platform engineering, I mean, or the plural of platform sounds a little bit, I would say, GPT'd, but in essence, I really say thanks to Gregor, who basically came up with this idea for this title, because I think it explains very well what I will talk about. But you will figure out on the go. First things first, who am I? I guess a couple of people know me anyway, but for those who don't know me, I'm David. I'm originally based from Vienna. I shifted my location a little bit more to Munich in the last couple of years due to, Square-related reasons. I still act in Vienna. I still support a couple of clients in Vienna, but my main branch these days is in Munich. And that's why I'm still very happy to come to Vienna from time to time for special events like this. And especially, of course, this one particular, because I also kind of was involved in the organization of this event for quite a while. And I really understand how much effort this is to bring something up in terms of a community event. So I would really also like to say thank you again for those people who make this possible. So why the fuck should you basically listen to me, to what I have to say, and what's basically in for you now, I think. So like I said, I talked a lot about platform engineering, so if you look up my name and find on YouTube a lot of conference talks where I covered particular topics around this matter, because it basically drives me, and I always talk about things that drive me, and it basically drives also our clients these days. And what I find especially interesting always in my nature as a software engineer, I would say, is always this, I would say, composition of what a good software engineer is about, right? And what basically drives good technical solutions in the end for organizations. And this is also very true for platforms, right? Because platforms are always kind of, in this very interesting middle point, of people, of the domain of an organization, right, and the technology. And these days I usually do not call this domain anymore, because then people say, okay, yeah, domain-driven design, I read the blue book, but I basically really mean the business, right? Understanding what makes a business profitable, what makes a business successful is kind of important. And I think platform engineering is potentially, for me, so interesting for years now, because I think it needs to kind of, compose all these things. And ultimately, you also need to understand a lot about the culture, right, when it comes to building platforms. And first of all, who of you is building a platform? Who considers him or herself as a platform engineer? Okay. Who is a DevOps engineer, so more located with the teams? Okay. Who is a software engineer, so consuming a platform? Okay. Interesting. And who is more like SRE? fantastic, a perfect audience. So I cannot do anything wrong anymore because I think it's nice if we have different perspectives here. So where do we come from in platform engineering? I think the story is very simple to explain, and I basically always explain it in a similar way, but we do platforms these days for a very simple reason, and this reason is, I would say, baked in organization design, baked in how we build systems these days, right? Because we shifted from, monolithical, big, huge systems, right, which were, I would say, horizontally layered, organized, to, I would say, this classical service-oriented microservices, however you want to call them, self-contained systems, where teams basically can contain and own a domain independently end-to-end, so can basically on their own deliver business value, right? And this is how we structured our organizations, and this is how we designed them, with the simple premise, right, that we say high autonomy basically leads to high independence, and high independence leads to higher pace, right? This is why we did this. We didn't do this because we just think it's so nice to have smaller teams. We did this because we think smaller teams, especially in the domain of software engineering, can deliver higher value faster, right? And I think it's very important before we talk about platform engineering to first of all understand also the restrictions on this, right? Because this whole hypothesis of higher pace by high autonomy only basically works based on two assumptions, right? And these assumptions are basically that we have high responsibility within our teams and that we have strong alignment. And what do I mean by this? I think if we do not have these two things in place, right, we cannot cover any of these problems with a great platform afterwards, right? And so I think it's important for us, before we start going into this, to basically understand these basics which our organization needs to provide, that we can basically solve issues with the technology, right? And in terms of responsibility, it's very simple, right? If you give people high autonomy, they also need to take high responsibility, right? If you do not achieve this, then you usually end up in something which we tend to call the ops will hate you zone, right? Because basically teams do whatever they do, right? But they don't take responsibility for what they build, right? Or the other thing is the devs will quit you zone, right? Where they basically need to take high responsibility for things where they cannot really make their own decisions, right? And this is basically Werner Vogel's you build it, you run it, right? Saying you build the stuff, but you take care of it, right? And I don't say that you need to do you build it, you run it, and we see it's not working in a lot of organizations because, cultural things, a lot of restrictions around this, but we need to be somewhere on this blue line, right? If we are not somewhere there, we basically always have this mismatch of autonomy versus responsibility, right? So it could be you build it, you care it, you build it, you run it, and stuff like that, right? So that's the first very important part, yeah? If we do not have this in place, we have in general a problem, right? Which we also cannot solve afterwards with platforms. The second one, which I meant, was strong alignment, right? And this is, again, very simple to be visualized, right? We need strong alignment, right? And we all know this potentially, right? We worked in organizations where we had strong alignment but low autonomy, right? The typical example, from this KCD comic is always saying, hey, we need to basically cross a river. And then the boss tells us build a bridge, right? And we all built that bridge, right? Low autonomy, strong alignment. Could work, potentially even works, right? Downside, it doesn't bring a lot of innovation, right? What we also a lot of times see is low autonomy and low alignment, right? Which is, I would say, classical micromanagement, right? Everybody's managed to do something, right? But something doesn't fit together to a big picture, right? And basically the same thing is, I would say, entrepreneurial organizations, right, where everybody's still doing something without big alignment, but everybody's happy, right? That's a big difference. And where we usually want to end up is, I would say, strong alignment with strong autonomy, right? Where we say we need to cross the river, right? And the requirement is basically, let's figure out how to do this, right? And this is where we usually want to be, that we, with OKRs or with whatever kind of goal-setting system, we figure out that our alignment is strong, but people are still autonomous in figuring out what's the best solution for a given problem, right? And yeah, this is basically driving innovation, right? And software engineering is a lot about innovation these days. So I think these two characteristics are quite important, yeah? And even if we think about this now, right? If we say, okay, we have this in place, right? We have this understanding, we have a good fit between autonomy and responsibility and autonomy and alignment, we still need to understand how does this all work together if we now do this, right? If we now say we have these teams which should deliver that stuff independently, right? And the consequence of doing this is usually, and we hear this a lot, right, is that we have knowledge silos within these teams, and we have, massive mental load within the teams, or cognitive load, however you want to call it, right? And what we want to solve now usually is these two problems, right? And the first solution, which I hear usually, is we need more governance, right? And we need a platform that ensures this governance, right? And governance, of course, means that we basically go here and say, let's put a governance layer on top of this. Let's align which things we are allowed to do, which things we are allowed to use, and how we are allowed to do things, right? And the problem is this is, of course, in a conflict with high autonomy, right? The second thing which we usually do is, we say we need more reusability, right? We built this here, and we built that here, and we built this here, and it's kind of the same thing. Why don't we just reuse it, right? And of course, this can be also achieved with a platform, but the problem is that reusage is, another word for dependency, right? Which then, of course, reduces this high independence, right? And last but not least, we could, of course, say, hey, if we don't want to bound ourselves together by reusage, if we don't think that this governance thing will help the teams to act in the best manner for this organization, then we could, of course, say, hey, let's, share knowledge. Let's build up communities, like let's break the silos by, having some kind of guilds or things where people can then collaborate, right? But of course, this costs time again, and if your organization is in high pace, people usually always over prioritize the delivery in terms of doing that, right? And my point is that all of these things are very useful, right? We potentially need more governance, we need more reusage, and we need more collaboration, right? I don't say that this is not the point here I want to make. But the point is that platform engineering is not the right tool to achieve this, right? And the question is, what do we achieve then actually with platform engineering, right? Platform engineering is not there to fulfill those three things, but is there to basically accelerate the speed of our delivery, right? And not so much about reusage and standardization, right? So if you want to tackle the problem that people do not reuse things, or people don't follow a standard in your organization, then I think you cannot overcome this problem with platforms, right? Because in the end, platforms, and I explain you what I mean by this in a second, are optimizing for economy of speed instead of economy of scale, right? And what I mean by this is when we basically want to speed up things in our industry, we usually have this model in mind, right? We have the common things, we have the more specific things, and on top of this, we put a little bit of configuration. And by following this model, this is how we achieve reusage, right? And this is how low platforms usually look like, for example. A low-code platform basically comes exactly with these problems, right? They tell you we solved all the common things, even some specific things, and the best thing, you just need to configure a few things and you have your solution, right? Is this a platform? Potentially not, in my perspective, right? Because what good platforms are about is a little bit a different model, a different mind I think you need to have in mind, yeah? And it's about the complicated or complex technology, right? Which you basically want to hide away by unified interface, by abstractions, to basically then build diverse applications on top of this. And you would not say, okay, this is basically the same, right? But it's not the same, and I think it's very important to understand this difference, right? On the one hand side, right, we do not limit the problem space, right? But we limit the solution space, right? And by giving this kind of harmonization our solution space, we basically accelerate building stuff on the problem space. Versus here, we usually limit the problem space, right? This is basically where those platforms fall apart, because suddenly you figure out, okay, I want to do something which doesn't work on these abstractions anymore, right? So the essence of platforms is basically limiting the solution space to accelerate building on a problem space, right? And I think a very good example for this is usually that we need to understand that the complex tech is usually not the differentiator, right? But what differentiates us usually is, of course, the diverse applications, yeah? And there's this good blog post from Gregor, which I really enjoy, because it basically tells the same story to say, you know, if you take a look at the car industry, they basically use the same terms like we use, right? They say we have in cars this platform, and these platforms are basically used to basically then build cars on top of them, right? And the cars are diverse, right? The cars need lower investment, right? And these cars are then the diversification, right? But the platform itself is basically standardization, right? It's basically a high investment to build a new platform, but it's basically no market differentiator, right? And I think that's a very good example of how you should think platforms within your organization, right? We basically try to get rid of this reusage problem, which is, I would say, a fetish as old as unfulfilled in our industry, right? To say we basically want to accelerate the speed of building new things. And I just a few days again talked with one of our clients, and he basically said the same thing, right? Our problem is not so much the cost in that sense. Our problem is the speed, right? Our problem is that we do not get things delivered fast enough for our clients. Not so much that we say, okay, if we would reuse all the things we already have, we could maybe save 50% of the costs, right? Because the real cost limit usually is the time to market, right? The investment we need to do to basically kind of come up with a solution that then basically fulfills the customer needs. Yeah? And my personal favorite KPI to measure this, to measure if we do the right thing in a platform, is that we basically need to understand that when we build something like this, right, we should be surprised what people can build on top of this, right? Because this is exactly what we want to do, right? This is exactly what we want to achieve as a platform, to say we build something, right, where somebody built something on top of it which we didn't expect, right? And I think a good example is, of course, all kind of platforms we already have, right? It's not like we invented platforms 5 years ago, right? Linux is a platform. It's a wonderful platform, right? I think Linus Torvalds would have never expected that we build a crypto miner on top of Linux, because he didn't know what a crypto miner is back in the days when he invented Linux, right? And I think this is the mindset which we need when we really want to build sustainable and long-living platforms, I would say, in our industry. And another thing I really like about platforms is that I really like to measure them, right? And the measurement of Linux would be simple, right? Usage. Do people use it, right? And obviously they do it, otherwise it wouldn't exist anymore, right? And the same is true for platforms, right? I think it's a platform needs to fulfill its premise that it makes people faster in doing this stuff, right? And the most powerful thing to basically measure this is, from my perspective, the Net Promoter Score. So like you measure any other product on the market, you should also start to measure your platform, right? If you do not do this, and if you do not get these insights, right, this is not to kind of, kill your platform. This is kind of to understand if you build the right thing with your platform. Your platform will anyway at some point in time die, right? Because people will just not invest the money anymore because nobody sees the benefit for what we kind of build in terms of a platform, right? So thinking, do people build stuff that surprises me, and people basically recommend my platform to other teams? I think are the two most powerful KPIs which you need to consider if you build a platform in your organization. And I need to push a little bit on the speed now. But of course, all I told you is about abstractions, right? And abstractions is such a funny thing, right? Because we are the kings of abstractions, right? No other industry in the world, or I think in history, or potentially also in the future, will invent so many abstractions like we invented, right? We started with 0 and 1, right? And we basically ended up in what we do these days, right? And sometimes it's funny because I, draw some architectures on a Miro board. My girlfriend comes in and asks me, what are you doing? And I say, this is an architecture of software, right? And then I was thinking, but I cannot really explain you this, right? Because this thing doesn't really exist, right? You cannot open my laptop and see this architecture somewhere running, right? It's an abstraction, abstractions on abstractions on abstractions, right? And I think platform engineering is just another vehicle to help us doing these abstractions, because they brought us very far, right? And getting the abstractions right is basically in the essence, I would say, yeah? And for example, one example I see very often these days is that we do not get these abstractions right? Because platforms are usually abstracting away infrastructure, right? So you could say I have a container, I have a database, I have a Kafka topic, I have a dashboard, I have read models, right? And when I want to deploy an application as software engineer, I need to do all these 5 YAML files to get my application up and running, right? So we basically have an infrastructure-centric view on the problem. But this is not the view a user has on the problem, right? A user shouldn't care if there's a container, if there's a network, if there's a Kafka topic, if there's all these things, right? A user should basically say, hey, I want to deploy a stateful application, I want to deploy an event processor, I want to deploy a cron job, right? And in the end, we handle basically what is done for us, right? So we could talk a whole day about what is right abstractions in platform engineering, but I think what's important is that good abstractions are usually more about abstraction than about composition when it comes to platform engineering. Yeah? So your main job as a platform engineer is basically not all the technical stuff, all the things that lie beyond this, right? It's basically figuring out what is the need of the application development teams that should drive innovation in our organizations, and how can we basically help them getting faster in doing this with useful abstractions. Yeah? And a useful abstraction is not something super complicated, right? Doesn't need to be a high sophisticated technical solution, right? A useful abstraction can be a simple playbook, right? What makes you think that a user will use your system to kind of define a 60 lines YAML file to configure a service deployment if you were not able to explain it to him in a simple wiki page how to do it, right? And I think that's very important, right? We should really, as we always do in software, start very small to understand that basically, right, good processes, right, require good documentation, and then we can build our automation or self-service probabilities on top of this, right? It's always the same, right? If the DevOps processes, if the CI processes, if the CD processes, if the organizational problems suck, right, you will have no chance to build a proper platform on top of this, right? And these processes are basically driven by the users, right? And this is exactly where our effort should go, right? That we say we need to understand this is where we need to work, basically, right? Not the funny part on the top. Yeah? And this is also how you need to staff your platform engineering teams, right? A platform engineering team should not be a composition of the best DevOps engineer within your organization. It should be a composition how you would build a product that basically makes your developers happy. So let's quickly sum up that we also have some time for questions. I think the key takeaway here is that platform engineering is all about, and how the North usually tends to say it, reducing the lead time to thank you that your teams are basically achieving with the software they build, right? And I think platform engineering is a lot more, about the user, about the obsession, what your users basically want to achieve in this organization, and a lot less about the technical stuff that we, of course, can build on top of it. And I think it's so important that we start with this MVP, this minimum viable platform, right? What is really the minimum we can do to basically accelerate this, right? And stop building these huge platforms again, right? That ultimately have lost the understanding what is actually in for our application developers to basically get the things done faster. And I think it really starts simple, right? It starts with the processes, it starts with the good documentation, it starts, of course, with the automation at some point in time. And it maybe ends with a self-service platform at a certain level, right? And that's my point, right? And that's my experience, that's my key takeaway, that's my thing I would mention first if people talk about platforms with me these days in organizations, to start small to avoid failing big. Yeah? Thanks a lot, I hope this was useful.
Vielen Dank, David. Awesome. Thank you so much for talking. I really like the LinkedIn post, right, with the car analogy. Yeah. I think that's really amazing. Like investing in that foundation to then build differentiation on top. Folks, we have 5 more minutes for questions. There is one already up there in row number 5, or I think it's 5 or 6. There you go.
Can unfortunately not see anything.
I'll go over here.
Okay, I hope you can hear me at least.
Yes.
I have a question about platforms that should be established afterwards. Do you see any benefit in having an existing ecosystem, an existing system completely, and afterwards implement the platform and force the existing systems to move to this platform, like migrating to it?
Yes. I actually see a lot of benefits in doing this, even more benefiting building a platform up front, to be honest. I'm big on rule of three, right? Something gets reusable if three different use cases use it, right? So I think we should start harvest much more platforms than we kind of, build platforms from scratch, right? We should understand, okay, we have, I don't know, an ecosystem where we can deploy services, where we run services, where we do a lot of things, or developers do a lot of things. What can we basically accelerate there to make the life easier? And I think it's much easier to start this from a brownfield than, to start this from an empty paper, to be honest. Yeah? So I would always recommend actually going this way, right? Saying, hey, what are the problems we have right now? And this can be a rarity, right? This can be security. This can be, like we said, speed, right? It's usually a composition of those things, and then really start to do those things that help you make the life of your developers easier. Yeah? And as I said, usually it starts with the processes. It goes over to documentation. It goes over to automation, and then it goes over to the self-service part, right? And I think in this order, right? You cannot. If you automate shitty processes, the automation will be shitty, right? And if you build self-service on shitty automated processes, the self-service will be shitty, right? So I think we really need to understand how do we get the processes right for our engineers to build great stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for that question. Anybody else? There's a question over there. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I tried to put it into a car analogy. What would your suggestion be to avoid having the base of a car? Because for cars, for a crankshaft or whatever, there have been tens of years of development, and there are standards that just are established. For many of our technologies in IT, they just have been emerging, and the people maybe working on them have different knowledge. What would your suggestion be to avoid having crankshaft that may be designed fundamentally wrong from the beginning? And what would your suggestion be to work with it when it's already established? Could it be fixed, or should it be thrown out and redesigned?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. So the first part maybe of the question, I think you really need to understand what is the differentiator in your current business, right? Or in your current organization, your current domain, right? So for example, using something like Wardley mapping or other tools where we say, hey, what is really there that, kind of gives our organization currently the USP, and usually it's not the Kubernetes cluster, right? So it's easy to argue that this should be something that would basically not spend a lot of time in our teams on, right? And then I would try to really objectivize this, right? I would really like to understand where in the DevX experience of our teams are we losing most of the time, right? And what basically should then go into such a platform. How to get the platform right, if I would know this, I wouldn't stand here anymore, because I would be a rich person, I guess. But it's about finding the right abstractions, right? And finding the right abstraction, again, goes in the very first picture of this presentation. You need to understand the organization, you need to understand the business, and you need to understand the technology, right? And this is basically also the only reason why we have platform engineering teams in organizations, right? AWS or any other hyperscaler is usually much better in building that things, right? I think there's no way to compete with an Austrian bank against a hyperscaler. But what an Austrian bank has is it has the knowledge about its organization, about its domain. And this is why it usually finds the better abstractions than some just generic hyperscaler, right? And I think if we do not fulfill this promise, right? If we just build technical abstractions on technical abstractions, then, we build this thinking platform, because we will never be able to kind of, keep up to speed with how the underlying things change, right? But what usually is not changing is the core concepts, right, of our business, right? It's usually not changing is that we need this kind of job that does this every second day, right? In the end, it doesn't matter what technology underlying is, right? But this is the layer we need to get right. And I think to the last part of your question, the only way you can solve this is by starting small, right? Start small, figure out if it works, if it helps, and scale it from teams to teams, and really always get feedback. And what I often say, and a couple of people know this quote maybe already, I think the beauty of platform engineering in big organizations is that it's one of the rare products you build in an enterprise where you can really have daily contact with your customers, right? If you build web banking solutions, usually you never get the direct feedback, right? But if you build a platform, you can go 5 desks further and ask the developer, does this help you? And I think we should really start to utilize this more, yeah?
Awesome. I also like the shitty process, shitty automation, shitty self-service. So you want to cleaning up the shit on the bottom first. Last question before we break for lunch. Go one, go twice. All right. Then, folks, thank you so much. And also, David, thanks again. Another round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Please.